The crystalline halls of the Celestian Palace stretched endlessly before Nova Blackwood as she was led through corridors that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Her footsteps echoed against floors that sparkled like trapped starlight, each step carrying her further from everything she had ever known. The diplomatic escort, tall ethereal beings with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl, maintained a respectful but firm presence around her. Nova's heart thundered in her chest, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Just 3 days ago, she had been in her research facility on Earth's newest colony world, studying the integration of terrestrial plants with alien ecosystems. Now she stood as a gift to Queen Estrella of the Celestians, a gesture of goodwill from the human diplomatic corps that she hadn't agreed to. The escort paused before massive doors that seemed to be carved from a single piece of opalescent crystal. Nova watched as they swung open silently, revealing a throne room that took her breath away. The ceiling soared impossibly high, its surface alive with swirling patterns of light that mimicked the galaxy itself. But it was the figure on the throne that commanded attention. Queen Estrella rose as Nova entered, her movements fluid like water catching sunlight. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her form more slender than human proportions would allow, with skin that seemed to contain entire nebulae beneath its surface. Her eyes, when they fixed on Nova, were the deep purple of space itself, with points of light that could have been stars. So, the Queen's voice resonated with a musical quality that made Nova's skin tingle. This is the human botanist I've heard so much about. She descended the steps of her throne with otherworldly grace, circling Nova with undisguised curiosity. Nova bowed, remembering her hasty diplomatic briefing. Your Majesty, I am honored to be presented to your court. The words tasted bitter, formal things that couldn't capture the complexity of her situation. Tell me, Estrella stopped before her, head tilted in a way that reminded Nova of curious birds on Earth. Do you consider yourself a gift, Nova Blackwood? The question caught her off guard. She had expected to be dismissed, to be sent to whatever quarters would house the Queen's newest acquisition. Instead, she found herself caught in that starlit gaze, feeling as though her answer mattered more than she understood. I consider myself a scientist, Your Majesty, Nova replied carefully. My work with cross-planetary botanical integration was my life's purpose. Being presented to your court was not my choice. A smile curved the Queen's luminescent lips. How refreshingly honest. Most who enter these halls wrap themselves in layers of diplomacy and pretense. She gestured, and a small sphere of light floated from her hand, expanding to show images of vast gardens unlike anything Nova had seen before. Are you familiar with our twilight gardens? Nova's scientific curiosity overrode her diplomatic caution. I've only read theoretical papers about them. The way your flora responds to celestial energy rather than traditional photosynthesis is fascinating. I've been working on theories about potential hybrid systems that could. She caught herself, realizing she was rambling. But Queen Estrella's expression had shifted from mild interest to something sharper, more focused. Continue, she commanded, but there was an eagerness in her tone that hadn't been there before. For the next several minutes, Nova found herself explaining her research, watching as the Queen's expression grew more animated. She spoke of the possibilities of combining Earth's resilient plant species with Celestian energy absorption techniques, of creating hybrid species that could thrive on worlds that currently supported neither. Fascinating, Estrella murmured, and Nova finally fell silent. You see possibilities where others see only barriers. She turned to her attendants. Show Nova to the research wing, not the diplomatic quarters. And inform Cassiopeia that she has a new colleague. Nova blinked in surprise. Your Majesty. You were presented as a gift, Estrella said, her star-filled eyes twinkling with amusement, but I prefer to think of you as an opportunity. Unless you would rather be displayed as an exotic curiosity in my court. No, Nova said quickly, then added, thank you, Your Majesty. As she followed her escort toward her new quarters, Nova's mind raced with possibilities. She hadn't chosen to come here, but perhaps she could make something meaningful of her situation. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Queen Estrella's interest than mere scientific curiosity. She was right. What Nova couldn't know was that the Twilight Gardens were dying, and she had just become central to the Queen's desperate plan to save them, and with them, the future of the Celestian civilization itself. The Twilight Gardens stretched before Nova like a dream made manifest, crystal trees reaching toward the eternal dusk sky of the Celestian world. 2 weeks had passed since her arrival, and each day brought new wonders that challenged everything she thought she knew about botanical science. The degradation is spreading faster than we anticipated, Cassiopeia said beside her, the Celestian scientist's bioluminescent markings pulsing with concern. She pointed to a cluster of crystal-like plants whose usual brilliant glow had dimmed to a sickly flicker. Nova knelt beside the failing vegetation, her hand hovering over its surface. Unlike Earth plants, these didn't have leaves or traditional stems, they were more like living crystal, channeling energy through intricate internal lattices. Have you tried adjusting the resonance fields? Every variation we know, Cassiopeia's shoulders slumped, her usual ethereal grace diminished by worry. These gardens have sustained our people for millennia. Without them, Nova understood the unspoken implications. The Twilight Gardens weren't just beautiful, they were the heart of Celestian civilization, providing both food and energy. Their failure would be catastrophic. Nova. Queen Estrella's voice carried across the garden, and Nova turned to find the monarch approaching, her presence making the very air seem to shimmer. 2 weeks of regular interaction hadn't diminished the impact of her otherworldly beauty, but Nova had learned to see past the initial awe to recognize the keen intelligence in those star-filled eyes. Your Majesty, Nova straightened, brushing crystal dust from her knees. I think I might have an idea, but it's unconventional. Estrella's expression softened with amusement. I'm beginning to learn that unconventional is your specialty. She gestured for Nova to continue. These plants evolved to absorb and process celestial energy, Nova explained, pulling up a holographic display of her research. But they're not just gathering it, they're transforming it. What if we could help them adapt to use multiple energy sources? Theron, the Queen's chief advisor who had appeared silently behind Estrella, scoffed. You propose to alter the fundamental nature of our sacred gardens? This is precisely the kind of human presumption that... Let her finish, Estrella cut him off, her eyes never leaving Nova. Nova projected a simulation showing her proposed modifications. We don't need to change their nature, just expand their capabilities. Like teaching someone who already knows one language to speak another. They'll still be who they are, just more adaptable. Estrella stepped closer, studying the projection. Nova tried to ignore how the Queen's proximity made her pulse quicken, focusing instead on the technical details of her proposal. But when Estrella's hand brushed her arm, pointing to a particular detail in the simulation, Nova's breath caught. This integration point, Estrella said, either not noticing or choosing to ignore Nova's reaction, it's similar to the ancient patterns in our historical records. What? Nova leaned in, their shoulders nearly touching as they examined the display. You mean your ancestors used something like this? Not exactly, but, Estrella broke off as one of the nearby crystal plants suddenly flared with brilliant light. They both stepped back in surprise, watching as the glow spread to neighboring plants. Fascinating, Cassiopeia breathed, her scientific instruments whirring. The energy patterns, they're stabilizing. Nova stared in wonder. But we haven't even implemented any changes yet. How? Perhaps, Estrella said softly, the gardens recognize a kindred spirit. Her gaze when it met Nova's was intense, searching. You see them as living beings, not just resources or decorations. That's rare, even among my own people. Theron cleared his throat disapprovingly. My queen, while this display is impressive, we cannot base our survival on human intuition and lucky accidents. Can we not? Estrella challenged, turning to face him. When our own methods have failed, should we cling to them out of pride? She gestured to the still glowing plants. The gardens respond to her. That alone deserves our attention. Nova felt caught between relief at the Queen's support and discomfort at being the center of such a charged debate. I don't claim to have all the answers, she said carefully. But I believe if we combine our knowledge, Celestian tradition and human adaptation, we might find a solution together. Estrella's expression softened into something that might have been pride. Well said. She turned to Cassiopeia. Give Nova access to the historical archives. Full access, she added with a pointed look at Theron, who stiffened but didn't object. As the others departed, Estrella lingered. You continue to surprise me, Nova Blackwood. Is that a good thing? Nova asked, suddenly aware of how alone they were in the softly glowing garden. Estrella's laugh was like starlight made sound. In 9 centuries of rule, I've learned that the most valuable things in any realm are those that can still surprise you. She reached out, touching one of the crystal plants, and Nova watched in amazement as its glow intensified, responding to her presence. Perhaps that's why the gardens respond to you. You remind them how to grow in unexpected ways. Nova wanted to respond, but found herself lost in the way the garden's light played across Estrella's features. The Queen must have sensed her gaze, because she turned, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with something Nova couldn't name. Finally, Estrella spoke, her voice softer than before. Work your wonders, Nova. Show us what's possible when we dare to grow beyond our boundaries. With that, she glided away, leaving Nova alone with the gently pulsing gardens and the thundering of her own heart. That night, Nova dreamed of crystal gardens and star-filled eyes, and woke wondering if she was the only one being transformed by this unexpected partnership. Nova stood alone in the depths of the twilight gardens, surrounded by the soft pulse of crystalline vegetation in the perpetual dusk. The archives had revealed something extraordinary. The gardens weren't just plants, they were a vast network of semi-sentient life, capable of communication through subtle energy patterns. What the Celestians had always interpreted as simple resource exchange was actually a complex language of light and resonance. She placed her hand against one of the larger crystal formations, closing her eyes to focus on the subtle vibrations beneath her palm. At first, there was only the familiar hum of energy, but then, something else. A pattern, a rhythm, like a heartbeat but more complex. What are you trying to tell me? She whispered. The crystal's glow intensified under her touch, and suddenly Nova felt it, not just the physical sensation, but a presence, an awareness. The crystal was responding to her thoughts, its energy patterns shifting to match her neural activity. Her eyes flew open in surprise, but she maintained contact, afraid to break this unexpected connection. Remarkable, a voice said softly behind her. I've never seen them respond like that. Nova turned to find Queen Estrella watching her, the monarch's own bioluminescence creating a gentle aurora around her form. The Queen approached with that fluid grace that still made Nova's breath catch, even after weeks in her presence. They're conscious, Nova said excitedly, forgetting protocol in her enthusiasm. Not like us, but they have their own form of awareness. They're trying to communicate. Instead of the skepticism Nova expected, Estrella's expression showed intense interest. She moved closer, placing her own hand near Nova's on the crystal surface. Show me. Nova hesitated only briefly before covering Estrella's hand with her own, guiding it to the spot where the connection felt strongest. The moment their hands touched, the entire garden seemed to come alive with light. Crystal structures all around them began to pulse in synchronized patterns, creating waves of luminescence that rippled outward into the darkness. Estrella gasped, her star-filled eyes widening. I feel it, she breathed. After all these centuries, how did we never? She trailed off, transfixed by the display. Nova was equally captivated, but not just by the gardens. The Queen's hand was warm beneath hers, and their shared connection to the crystal network created an intimacy that made her heart race. She could feel Estrella's pulse through their joined hands, synchronizing with the garden's rhythms. They're dying, Estrella said suddenly, her voice tight with emotion. Not just failing, they're in pain. How could we not have known? Before Nova could respond, a sharp voice cut through their moment of connection. My queen, you must see this. Theron stood at the garden's entrance, his usually perfect composure showing signs of strain. There's been an incident. Estrella withdrew her hand reluctantly, breaking the connection. The garden's glow immediately dimmed to its normal level. What kind of incident? The outer gardens, Theron said, shooting Nova a suspicious glance. They're changing. Ever since we gave the human access to them, they've been exhibiting unprecedented behaviors. Some members of the court are concerned. Concerned? Estrella's voice took on an edge Nova hadn't heard before. Or threatened? Both, Theron admitted. Orion has called for an emergency council session. He claims the human presence is corrupting our most sacred resource. Nova felt her stomach twist. Orion, leader of the traditionalist faction, had made no secret of his opposition to her presence in the gardens. The changes aren't corruption, she protested. The gardens are trying to adapt, to save themselves. If we don't help them evolve, they'll die. And we should trust your word on this? Theron's tone was cold. For all we know, these changes are exactly what your people planned when they sent you here. Enough, Estrella commanded, and both Nova and Theron fell silent. The queen's bioluminescence had intensified, making her seem to glow from within. Nova has proven herself worthy of our trust. More importantly, she has shown us truths about our own world that we were too blind to see. She turned to Nova, her expression softening slightly. But Theron isn't wrong about the political implications. The council must be addressed. To Theron, she added, arrange for Nova to present her findings directly to them. My queen, Theron protested, there's no precedent for allowing a human to address the full council. Then we will make one, Estrella said with finality. The gardens are speaking to us through her. Only a fool would ignore such a message. After Theron departed, clearly unhappy with the decision, Estrella turned back to Nova. Are you ready to face the council? Nova swallowed hard. Do I have a choice? There are always choices, Estrella said softly. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Nova's face with unexpected tenderness. But sometimes the hardest path is also the right one. The touch sent a shiver through Nova that had nothing to do with the garden's energy fields. I never wanted to cause political upheaval in your court. No, Estrella smiled, her star-filled eyes twinkling. You only wanted to revolutionize our understanding of our most sacred natural resource and challenge 9 millennia of traditional knowledge. Despite her anxiety, Nova found herself laughing. When you put it that way. Get some rest, Estrella advised, though her hand lingered near Nova's face. Tomorrow, we change everything. She paused, then added more quietly, together. As Nova watched the queen glide away, she touched her cheek where Estrella's fingers had been. The garden around her pulsed with gentle light, as if responding to her racing heart. Tomorrow would indeed change everything, but Nova was beginning to realize that the most significant changes had nothing to do with politics or even science. They had to do with the way her soul seemed to resonate in harmony with a queen who had eyes full of stars. The Celestian High Council chamber was a marvel of crystalline architecture, its soaring dome reflecting the eternal twilight sky above. Nova stood at its center, surrounded by tiered rows of the most powerful beings in the Empire, their bioluminescent forms creating a living aurora of shifting colors. But it was Queen Estrella who commanded attention, seated on her crystalline throne, her star-filled eyes fixed on Nova with quiet confidence. You claim our sacred gardens are not just dying, but transforming, Orion's voice cut through the chamber, his tall form radiating skepticism. That they speak to you in ways they never have to us in 9 millennia of stewardship. Nova took a deep breath, steadying herself. The holographic display before her showed the garden's energy patterns, proof of everything she discovered. I don't claim special knowledge, she said carefully. I simply approached the gardens with different perspectives, allowing me to see patterns you might have overlooked. Patterns that conveniently support human intervention in our most sacred spaces, or I encountered. His bioluminescence flared with barely contained anger. And now, after mere months of your presence, the outer gardens show signs of unprecedented changes. Changes that threaten everything we hold dear. The changes you fear. Nova activated a new hologram, showing the garden's neural network. Are the gardens trying to save themselves? They're not just responding to energy, they're adapting, evolving, seeking new ways to survive. A murmur rippled through the council. Cassiopeia, seated among the scientific advisors, nodded encouragingly. But Orion wasn't finished. And we should trust the word of a human? He gestured dismissively. One who was sent here under suspicious circumstances, who gained unprecedented access to our most vital resource, and who now claims to understand it better than we do. That's enough. Estrella's voice carried authority that made even Orion pause. Nova has earned the right to be heard. Her insights have already revealed more about the gardens than centuries of traditional study. With respect, my queen, Orion's tone suggested anything but respect. Your fondness for this human has not gone unnoticed. Perhaps it clouds your judgment. The chamber fell silent. Nova felt her cheeks burn, but Estrella's expression remained regal and composed. My judgment, Orion, is what keeps you on this council despite your frequent challenges to my authority. Do not test its limits. Before Orion could respond, the chamber's lights flickered. A low rumble vibrated through the crystal walls. Nova felt it first, a disturbance in the garden's energy field, like a scream of pain. Something's wrong, she gasped, just as the emergency alerts began blaring. Theron burst into the chamber, his usual composure shattered. My queen, the outer gardens, they're destabilizing. The energy grid is failing. Chaos erupted in the council chamber. Nova turned to the holographic displays, rapidly cycling through sensor readings. What she saw made her blood run cold. This isn't natural degradation, she announced, her voice cutting through the panic. These are deliberate energy surges. Someone's attacking the gardens. Estrella was beside her in an instant, their shoulders brushing as they studied the data. Explain. These patterns, Nova pointed to sharp spikes in the energy readings, they're too regular, too focused. Someone's introducing harmful resonance frequencies, forcing the gardens to reject their own energy patterns. To what purpose? Estrella demanded, but Nova saw the understanding dawn in her star-filled eyes even as she asked. To prove I'm right, Orion's voice rang out. The council chamber fell silent as he stepped forward. To show that human influence brings only destruction. The gardens must be purged of all foreign elements, returned to their natural state. You're killing them, Nova's voice shook with anger. The gardens aren't just resources, they're living beings. This purge is torture. A temporary pain, Orion countered, to save them from permanent corruption. He turned to address the council. See how quickly our sacred heritage falls to ruin under human influence. We must act now, remove all trace of their presence, or lose everything our ancestors built. But Nova wasn't listening anymore. She had noticed something in the data, a pattern beneath the chaos. The gardens weren't just being attacked, they were reaching out, trying to communicate through the pain. Without warning, she placed her hands on the crystal console, closing her eyes to focus on the energy frequencies. The chamber's lights flickered again, but this time they stabilized into a pulsing rhythm. Nova, Estrella's voice held a note of warning, but also trust. What are you doing? Listening, Nova whispered. Through her connection to the console, she could feel the entire garden network, its pain, its fear, but also its determination. They're not giving up. They're adapting. The holographic displays exploded with light as new data streamed in. The garden's energy patterns were shifting, reorganizing themselves in ways that defied traditional Celestian understanding. Impossible, Orion breathed, watching as his attack frequencies were absorbed and transformed by the very network he sought to purify. Nova opened her eyes, meeting Estrella's gaze. "The Gardens aren't choosing between human and Celestian influence," she said softly. "They're choosing to become something new. Something stronger." Estrella's hand found hers on the console, and the connection deepened. Through their joined touch, Nova could feel the Queen's own connection to the Gardens, centuries of tradition meeting new possibilities. "The question," Estrella addressed the Council, but her eyes never left Nova's, "is whether we are wise enough to do the same." The chamber erupted in argument, but Nova barely heard it. In that moment, connected to both the Gardens and their Queen, she knew everything was about to change. The only question was whether it would be by choice or by necessity. And as warning alarms continued to blare throughout the palace, Nova realized they were about to find out. The Twilight Gardens blazed with unprecedented light, every crystal structure pulsing in harmony as two civilizations' knowledge merged into something entirely new. Nova stood at the heart of it all, her hands pressed against the central crystal matrix, serving as a bridge between ancient wisdom and evolution. Beside her, Queen Estrella channeled her own connection to the Gardens, their combined efforts fighting to stabilize the massive changes rippling through the network. "The frequency patterns are stabilizing," Cassiopeia called out from her monitoring station. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." But Orion wasn't finished. His sabotage devices, strategically placed throughout the outer Gardens, continued pumping destructive energy into the system. "You'll destroy everything we've built," he shouted, his own bioluminescence flaring with desperate intensity. "Our heritage, our very identity." "No," Nova's voice was steady despite the strain of maintaining the connection. "We're helping it grow. The Gardens aren't rejecting change, they're embracing it. Just as they always have." Through her connection to the crystal matrix, Nova could feel the truth of those words. The Gardens hadn't survived for millennia by remaining static, they had constantly evolved, adapted, grown. The Celestians had been so focused on preserving what they thought they understood, they'd forgotten to listen to what the Gardens were trying to tell them. "Show them," Estrella whispered beside her, and Nova felt the Queen's hand cover hers on the crystal surface. The contact sent a surge of energy through their connection, and suddenly the entire chamber was filled with living light. Holographic images blazed to life around them, but these weren't just data displays. The Gardens were showing their own history, centuries of growth and change, of adaptation and evolution. Each crisis had led to transformation, each challenge had sparked new growth. What Orion saw as corruption was actually the latest step in an endless dance of renewal. "This is what your ancestors understood," Nova addressed the assembled council, her voice carrying despite its softness. "The Gardens aren't just a resource to be preserved, they're partners in evolution. They've been trying to show you, but you were too afraid of change to see it." Orion's devices sparked and died as the Gardens' new energy patterns rendered them harmless. The traditionalist leader stared in disbelief as his plans crumbled. "But our ways, our traditions. Will live on," Estrella finished for him, enhanced by new understanding, not diminished by it. She turned to Nova, her star-filled eyes glowing with an emotion that made Nova's heart race. "Just as my life has been enhanced by understanding you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Around them, the Gardens continued their transformation, crystal structures shifting into new configurations that combined Celestian patterns with structures inspired by Earth's organic growth. It was beautiful, harmonious, and completely unprecedented. "The Garden Network is rewriting itself," Cassiopeia reported, her voice filled with wonder. "It's creating hybrid systems that are more resilient than either original form. The energy efficiency is... I've never seen anything like it." Nova felt it through her connection, the Gardens weren't just surviving, they were thriving, reaching for new possibilities that neither humans nor Celestians had imagined alone. And as she stood there, connected to both the Gardens and their Queen, she realized she was experiencing the same transformation. "You never were just a gift," Estrella said softly, her fingers intertwining with Nova's on the crystal surface. "You were a catalyst, a bridge between worlds. My world has been forever changed by your presence in it." Nova turned to meet her gaze, seeing in those star-filled eyes the same truth she felt in her own heart. "Change goes both ways," she whispered. "I'm not the same person who arrived here either." The council chamber had fallen silent, watching as their sacred gardens transformed into something new yet familiar, different yet undeniably right. Even Orion seemed subdued, perhaps finally understanding that true preservation meant allowing growth. "What happens now?" Nova asked, though her eyes never left Estrella's face. The queen smiled, and it was like watching stars being born. "Now we grow together," she said, her free hand rising to cup Nova's cheek. "The gardens have shown us the way, not to remain static, not to resist change, but to embrace it, to let it transform us into something stronger." "Together," Nova echoed, leaning slightly into Estrella's touch. The gardens pulsed around them in approval, their light creating patterns that seemed to weave their two forms into one. In that moment, Nova understood that she had found something she'd never expected when she was first brought to this world, not just purpose, not just understanding, but a place where she truly belonged. "My queen," Theron spoke up hesitantly, "the diplomatic implications of this transformation will need to be addressed." Estrella's laugh was like starlight made sound. "Yes, they will. And who better to help forge new diplomatic bonds than someone who has already bridged our worlds?" She turned to the council. "Nova came to us as a gift, but she stays as a partner, in science, in diplomacy, and," her gaze softened as it returned to Nova's face, "in all things." The gardens blazed brighter, as if celebrating their own role in bringing two worlds together. Nova felt their joy through the crystal matrix, their satisfaction at helping forge connections that went far beyond simple biology or physics. As the council chamber erupted in discussion about the implications of everything that had happened, Nova and Estrella remained connected through their touch on the crystal matrix, their fingers intertwined, their hearts beating in rhythm with the garden's pulse. They had all been transformed, the gardens, the Celestians, and Nova herself. But standing there, feeling the warmth of Estrella's touch and seeing endless possibilities in her star-filled eyes, Nova knew that some changes were always meant to be. The gardens had known it all along. Sometimes the most beautiful growth came from accepting not just what you were, but what you could become together.